Hey, it's Jess, and welcome to The Heartstrong, a podcast where we explore navigating the challenges in our lives. It's my personal mission to guide you towards your greatest potential. So come along with me as we explore living with courage, or as I put it, living heartstrong. Welcome to the Heartstrong podcast. On today's episode, I'm sitting down with Carol Dimas, who is the founder and president of Educational Advocacy Consulting. Carol is an Illinois State Certified Teacher in Elementary Education and Special Education K through 12. She's also a reading specialist and learning behavioral specialist. She holds a bachelor's degree in special education and a master's of science in special education. Educational Advocacy and Consulting is a consulting firm dedicated to assisting families whose children are in need of identification, support, and assistance within their school districts. She has offices in Illinois and Washington, D.C., and I am really looking forward to the conversation today. Before I welcome Carol, I want to let you know that I know Carol personally because she has been my family's advocate for my son Bodie in the public school system. And while we're not going to get into those juicy details, we're going to talk about the needs of children in the public school system, your rights as parents. And I hope that maybe even some, educators will be listening today, and we can talk about how we can continue to improve and work more together for the benefit of our students and families. So welcome to the podcast, Carol.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm so pleased to be here.
Yes. So I thought we would get started with a burning question that people might have, which is, why did you start EAC and how did you get involved in advocacy?
Well, that is a great question. So I started my career as a special education teacher, kind of a pioneer in that I had the first special education class in this district in a rather underserved community. And so, along with educating the children, I had to do a lot of educating with the other staff members as well as the other students. It was a great experience, and I found that passion to kind of reach out more to not just the students I was working with, but what could I do on a bigger level? And it kind of started my journey. And I would ask questions of children I'd be working with and find out that the families really weren't aware of their rights. So that led me to continue on. Reading has always been a passion. So becoming a reading specialist. But again, when I was working in a clinic setting and working with children with reading disabilities, and I'd say to the family, well, what does her IEP say? And they'd say, what's an IEP? And then I knew there was a lack of understanding and knowledge and information. So I went back and I studied special ed with that focus on special education law and advocacy, and started my business.
And here you are. And you must be entrepreneurial because you've built quite a business.
Thank you. Thank you. And the Washington, D.C. connection, if I might add, it's kind of interesting. I have a lot of family in that area, and a friend of a family member was really struggling, and my brother happened to mention, oh, you should talk to my sister, and he said, give me your number. And then all of a sudden, I happened to advocate for that individual, and that individual happened to be a member of Congress and told a lot of other people, and it started me on the journey toward working also in the Washington, D.C. area. So.
Wow. That's so cool. I love that.
Yeah.
So I thought, thinking about this conversation, I kind of see it in three parts because I think there's going to be people listening who are very educated on the IEP process and on the laws that govern, but there's going to be a lot of people who aren't. And so, and I know when I started this process with you, I mean, the reason we hired you is because even though my husband's an attorney and I'm an educated person, like we didn't know our rights. We didn't understand the process. It's very confusing. And so I thought we would start talking about just simply some of the laws and ideas that govern special education. And then we talk about like the landscape of education today, kind of what we're seeing. Just, I know it's a big topic, but just some trends. And then I want to talk about some specifics about how families can best advocate for their kiddos, because I think that's the question that and on that topic, I have to give a quick shout out to a mom named Christina Peace, who has gone through a lot with her son and sent me so many great questions and ideas through my DM on
Oh,
Instagram. So I
good.
just wanted to thank Christina publicly because she's just an awesome mom, and she contributed to the conversation today.
Fantastic.
So let's start with the law. And can you
Okay.
tell people what IDEA is, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Act?
Absolutely. So when we think of children with, and I'm talking about children from birth to 22, when we think about children with learning differences, severe medical needs, disabilities, etc., we have two major protections. One is the law of IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which states basically that every child, regardless of their differences or disabilities, are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. Now, that word appropriate, it's tested in the courts every day. Appropriate. What is appropriate? It's obviously can be a vague term, but every child is entitled to that. And then added to that is within the least restrictive environment, but they go together because that least restrictive environment it was meant to protect families so that children aren't like years and years ago. If your child had special needs, they were put into a classroom in the basement and that was it. So we know that children have a right to be educated in their home school with their typical peers if it's appropriate. So sometimes, if we're advocating for a child to go to a special therapeutic school because of needs, for me and for the family, that argument of LREs can be used actually against us. Oh no, but then they're
Mm.
not the least restricted. Always remember they go together. Free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So that is the obligation of IDEA, that law. And with that comes all the funding, which is funneled down from the federal government to the schools to provide direct specialized instruction. That's the other piece under IDEA. Not only do we identify and say this child's eligible, but there is an obligation to provide direct specialized instruction. Now, the other law that protects our children with differences or disabilities is the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. What that provides is that we have access. So there can be a situation which a child does not necessarily need specialized instruction. Let's just say a child who has type 1 diabetes. So, but they require certain accommodations to be made so they can access the environment. So they may not need special education under IDEA, but they may definitely need a plan, which in the school setting we call a Section 504 plan. And many of your
Mhm.
listeners probably have heard of that. Those are the two main ways that we support all children. Now, when they have an IEP, those accommodations for access are included. But again, for those that don't need specialized instruction, we have that Section 504 plan under ADA. So that's kind of the Reader's Digest version of the two laws.
Of the two laws. So can you give us an example, just if somebody's listening, of what is like, I guess, a scenario of free and appropriate public education kind of in conjunction with least restrictive environment? Like, what would be a scenario to help people understand what that looks like?
Perfect. I absolutely can. So, an example from an actual case that I'm dealing with now is a student who has some significant needs in terms of that student's ability to access material, academic material, and retain it due to their cognitive profile. That child has been placed in an environment where all day, except for PE and lunch, that child is in a special education classroom. So even though they're in a public school with other typical peers, they really don't have any meaningful inclusion.
Hmm.
So I have been fighting to ensure. Now, the first line of defense from the school district was, well, that child can't access third grade math. Well, They can be in the classroom during perhaps science and help with those experiments, and we can modify the curriculum. So that piece of inclusion was something that was so important to provide that child a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. Because being in the least restrictive environment, that doesn't mean the building you're in. You could be in a building with 800 other typical peers, but your child could be in the most restrictive because all day long they're in a classroom with 4 other children with disabilities. That's
Mm.
that's how we determine that restrictive LRE. So I have been fighting to ensure and to increase this child's time with typical peers for meaningful inclusion. And there are wonderful inclusion specialists across the country that make this a focus. And I often collaborate and reach out to those individuals. This is a very important piece for me. On the other end of the LRE, I have a case recently that I have gone in to advocate for this child to be placed in a private therapeutic setting. Child has not made progress in the public school setting, even in the most restrictive within the public school. So at this point, we know the intensity embedding of services for this child dictates that their least restrictive environment is a private therapeutic day where they can get the supports they require. And with that, we make arrangements for that child who happens to play an instrument and be very good at it to participate in band in their public school. We can make sure we still give them. But again, those are two examples. One where I'm taking them from an environment that the school considers less restrictive into more restrictive, and one going in the opposite
The other
direction.
way.
It all has to align with what's appropriate for that child. What are their needs?
And typically, I guess, a question that just comes up is how is that typically received by a school district when you feel like you need to move a child out of a public school setting into something like a therapeutic day school and vice versa? Like, are people typically, and I know there's a wide swath of people out there,
Sure.
is that typically welcomed, or is that something that you usually have to have, is it usually a challenge?
So, frankly, I have learned through the years that it is often at first received in a very defensive mode
Mhm.
because as if we're not doing a good job, therefore they want this child pulled.
Mm.
I try to be so careful to say that this is about what this child needs,
Mhm.
not what you are doing or not doing for the
Mhm.
child. It's about the embedding, the specialization that a private therapeutic day school can do. And that's why under IDEA we have that continuum of services
Right.
that can go from complete gen ed to even residential for students who
Mhm.
need it. But I will tell you that often it is kind of looked at in a defensive mode. And then also, it feels to families, Jessica, as if there's money involved because they know these schools cost money and
Mhm.
they don't want to give it to us because it costs so much money. And I don't blame families for feeling
Mhm.
that way, but it's not coming out of the pockets of the people sitting in the room and it's not
Right.
coming out of the salary. But often that's where they go to because they think, why else would they be fighting so hard against it? So I try as best I can to preempt by saying this isn't about anybody in this room. This is about this particular
Mhm.
student's needs. But that can often be a little bit of a battle.
I think that's such a good point about each individual student. And I know, when we've been in meetings together, one of the things that's very important for me to say is like, all the teachers and the therapists and the people in the room, you're doing a great job. I think most of
Yes.
those people come to the table because they really care about students with disabilities and special education needs. They want to do a good job. They want to see the kids succeed. I don't
Yep,
know the behind the scenes in the school, but I do wholeheartedly believe that the people sitting in the room who are on hands on with the kids really care. And so I
I
think it's
agree.
really important to say that in the podcast, that when we're talking about the education system, that we're talking about the system, we're talking about people making these big decisions and not about the people on the ground implementing them. Because I think, frankly, some of those people are very frustrated as well. They want different for the kiddos. I just had a conversation last week with a woman similar. She's a provider in the schools, and she's very passionate about what she does, and she's very frustrated with what she's seeing. So I think that we should just really call that out here too, that we appreciate all of you who are in the schools with our kids, because we know it's a huge undertaking.
I couldn't agree more. And it's frustrating for me because sometimes I'll look around the table because, again, this isn't where somebody gets all the vote. We're supposed to come to consensus and
Together.
everyone is equal. And sometimes I look around and I say, really, is there anyone here that disagrees that this particular student needs more? And I see so many of those individuals that are working hard directly with that child kind of looking down,
Mm,
not wanting to make eye contact. And it feels to me and to a parent that there's a hesitancy sometimes to speak up.
mhm,
And I always feel bad about that. And I encourage everyone to speak up. But there is a little bit of that going on, which again becomes frustrating because sometimes parents are even told things behind the scenes, but maybe it's not said in a meeting. And that's
mhm.
where we need to speak up. And I feel like the teachers that are working so hard with the child every day should feel absolutely free to say, you know what? I do believe this child could benefit more from this type of a setting and not feel like that might have a negative impact on them.
On them, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about sort of the big picture landscape of special education today. I think that the last 3 years have been rather challenging. I know there's been lots of different things that have happened in law and things through that. But
Yes.
just tell us, like, kind of what you're seeing today. What's the landscape of special education? Maybe what are like one or two of the trends or challenges that you're kind of witnessing globally through the school systems that you're working with?
Perfect. Well, I'll start with one big piece, and it's literacy.
Hmm.
We really, there's been so much going on really in the past 10 years especially, but we really understand globally, and this is something that's very passionate to me as a reading specialist as well. But we understand how children learn to read, and they learn to read through that phonemic awareness,
Mhm.
and not through guessing or looking at the pictures or those kinds of things. That's how the brain learns to read, and it's the science of reading. And finally, our school districts, some much more advanced than others, are understanding it, incorporating it, getting rid of some of the old curriculum that doesn't use that. The way we know now that after years of studies how children really learn, there's been trends.
Mhm.
Depending on your age, you learned phonics, or you learned whole language, or you learned this, or you learned that. But we really know now this is science backed. So that piece has become a hot button issue because as parents become more educated and aware, and the ability now to say the D word, dyslexia, in
Mhm.
IEP meetings, and identifying so many children with dyslexia, that now schools are having parents come to them and say, hey, we know my child has dyslexia. We're able to say that in the IEP
Mhm.
meeting. Now we also know what works. It's like this medicine works for this. There's no
Right.
question about it. And they're demanding that, as they
Mhm.
should.
As they should.
Um, and then the problem is becoming that in some districts there's some pushback. Well, no, this is what we use. Well, if you're using that, I mean, you don't give this for this kind of a situation. This is the medicine for
Mhm.
this. So that's a hot button issue, and we get so many calls with this dyslexia piece and getting the right interventions. Now we have some great districts that have actually say, okay, we don't have the right trained people. They're actually hiring folks from our dyslexia center, because that's an
Wow.
offshoot now of what I have, to actually, and the district is paying for these highly trained individuals to come in and push into the school and provide instruction. I herald that.
Yeah, that's
It's
awesome.
because that's what it should be. It's like,
Yeah.
well, we don't have that here, but you can't say that to a parent. If you know your child needs social work, a school can't just say, sorry, we don't have a social worker. They've got to provide one, even if they have to pay for outside. But so there are some wonderful districts. That's a huge issue. That's a trend we're seeing. The other trend is an offshoot from the Andrew F. case, which was the Supreme Court case in 2016 that changed the landscape of special education. And that is the case where a family sued the school district because year after year after year, their child was not making progress. But the school said, well, he met his goals, he met his goals. Well, the problem was the goal wasn't the child's going to run a marathon, the child's going to walk 10 feet. Oh, guess what? He did it. And you're never going to get to the marathon.
Right.
So this case went all the way through the Supreme Court. And what it did is it changed the entire perspective that we must have ambitious goals,
Mm.
and those goals have to be in line with the unique profile of the child. They're
Mm.
unique. Not, well, here's what we do for our kids with autism. Here's what we do with our kids. That has been huge. The individualization of the goal and the rigor of the goal, the Andrew F. standard. So when I see year after year a family comes to me and this child, let's say it's a fluency goal for reading, and they've gained 2 words in a year, that doesn't fit that standard anymore. And that's
Mhm.
the law of the land through the Supreme Court. I can use that now to help fight. And that, I think, has finally changed. The frustrating thing for me, Jessica, is sometimes when I mention Andrew F. in a meeting, I would have to say at least 75% of the folks in there don't know what that is. And that's not
Wow.
on them, but
Right.
where is the training from above? Because the people sitting at the table working with our children have to have some understanding of these legal obligations as well if they're in the special ed field. I think that's missing.
And, like, where would
So,
that come from in a school? Like, if you're a speech therapist, how would you find out about that? Who
well,
should do
yeah,
that?
that's got to come from all of those learning opportunities. The all those teacher institute days where they go to various different professional training. The professional training has to get increased. Now, if your
Mm.
child has an IEP, there's an actual section in there, and those of you listening who have children with IEPs, it's called supports for school personnel. I will tell you 90% of the ones I pick up, it'll say yes or no, and they say no. And I think, what do you
Wow.
mean? This child has autism. The people that work with this child, anybody from a paraprofessional to someone working in the lunchroom, doesn't matter who it is, needs to understand that this child's, for example, communication can be limited. So they
Mhm.
can't be looked at as being non-compliant if they don't answer you. Everybody has to understand. So training in there is key. That's a key piece of that. But one other trend I do want to tell you that we're seeing is the abundance of our young um, adolescents starting, I would say, by the age of 12, 13, with significant mental health needs. And this is really weighs on me. These are the
Mm.
some of the cases that I lose sleep over.
Mm.
Children experiencing vulnerability and being the subject of perhaps someone with bad intentions, risky behaviors, etc. And then the mental health system not having enough supports or even beds. We could have a child God forbid, with a suicide attempt, but we can't find enough beds for a bed for that child to be inpatient. This is not an exception. This is some of the things that are going on. And it has obviously, as we all know, really increased during COVID. So
Mhm.
those are some of the big pieces that we hear when we get our calls every day.
So, I mean, just kind of pulling back to 30,000 feet, we're talking about, like, as a culture, we talk about how important our kids are and how important diversity is and how important, inclusion is. And we have all these buzzwords
Absolutely.
that everyone likes to post about on Instagram or LinkedIn or what have you. But it's like, we're all talking a big game, but we have some serious things that we're not taking care of our children, which we say are like our greatest resource, our most important. Is there a disconnect between the reality of the needs and people in the ability to provide that, like in their values? Like, where is the disconnect here?
Well, I do see that disconnect. I think there's been an awareness, at least uh, people posting about awareness
Yeah.
of understanding and tolerating differences,
Mhm.
regardless of where that is.
Yep.
But I think our children with disabilities and their acceptance and tolerance from others is lagging behind,
Yeah.
Jessica. I do. And even in the services provided, I feel that a lot of these children are getting left behind. And then what happens is, I find that when they get to a certain age, there's kind of a push toward, well, let's put you in this program and you can learn to clean the break room at TJ Maxx or something. And
Mhm.
I hate to be, and I don't mean to be flippant, but seriously, I worry about that.
Yeah.
There's got to be more in terms of starting from an early age, that inclusion opportunities and meaningful ways in which we're preparing children for post secondary, regardless of their disabilities, rather than kind of put a ceiling and funneling. We
Mm.
can't do that. So I think our population with disabilities has been a little bit left behind in some of the push for tolerance from some of the other areas, and they're all important.
They're all important, but I think some are like, I would say, like trending, right? And some
Yes,
aren't. And I don't think that we can have, in my opinion, I'll just say this is my opinion. I don't think we can have DEI without having including disability.
I
We can't
agree.
give lip service to that without also. And so, I'll ask you about that maybe in a little bit, but I just think that that's an important thing for people to realize, that we have this world that is moving forward and all of these things, but there are people that are being left behind, and that we do have to take the resources that we do have and the knowledge that we do have, and we have to continue to improve for these kiddos. And so, on that topic, I want to ask you about, like, the need for advocacy. It seems like you say, I get these calls. Like, has the need increased over the last few years? What are you
Oh
seeing
my
with that?
gosh. It is unbelievable. I mean, I'll just give you an example with our firm. I think last week we received over 40 calls from new clients,
Oh my gosh.
new
Mm.
clients that, and they all have a need. Like, I have a meeting next week and I realize I can't do this alone. I need your help. Or my child just got out of an inpatient program. Can you help me figure out where's the best therapeutic school, or things like that? These aren't things that and we get people in. We do these 30-minute free consults for anybody. And we understand the need. We're not like some professionals that can just say, well, there's a 6-month waiting list, what you put on,
Mhm.
because we understand with advocacy, there's timelines, there's a need. So we really do our best to get everybody in. But the increase, and I attribute it to two things: the lack of staff, because, COVID also changed the landscape of people rethinking their jobs and careers, etc. And we lost a lot of the workforce in
Mhm.
education, both in higher levels as well as in our paraprofessional support. And there are very important people.
Very
So we've
important.
lost a lot, and therefore services have suffered. But I also think parents are becoming more aware. There's groups of, families that get on and social media and say, I'm having trouble with this. And, that your community can be so important. And some of my colleagues will call and tease me and say, some of my younger moms that are also colleagues, and they'll say, I was on a parent's site and somebody said, oh my gosh, I'm struggling with this. And then someone, oh, you got to call Carol Dimas. And somebody else said, oh, yeah, she's a bulldog. So she said, I just want to tell you, I watched a whole stream of, but
Yeah.
anyway, but I think that parents are becoming a little bit more aware. Some families are. And then obviously with some of the changes in staff. But I will tell you though, Jessica, there is a huge gap in our more underserved communities, our communities where English is not a first language, and that has me extremely
Yeah.
concerned.
Well, and I think what happens in those communities is that if the parents don't know their rights, and then they can't advocate for their rights because they don't have either the ability to communicate or have the education or whatever, then their kids are just going to fall behind. And so, kind of on that topic, well, first of all, I want to ask you, do school systems see advocates like you as a help to the system? Like you're there to make them better? I mean, I know the answer to this question, but I got to ask it. Or do they see it as adversarial like most of the time?
So I wish it was seen as that. And in the few cases, sometimes I'll get an email from a professional, a staff member that was in an IEP meeting with me, and that individual will say, I just wanted to tell you, I appreciate, I learned so much from you, or something
Mhm.
like that. And that's just, I just love those. But uh, I'm going to be very honest with
Yeah,
you. I think that when my name comes across, or one of my colleagues, no, I don't think anyone's throwing a parade, because and it's sad. And so,
it is.
you've been with me a long time, but every time I first come and sit with a family, I always say, I'm not here in any adversarial capacity, because and I believe this to my core. If we can work together, the child wins. So
Yeah.
that is going to be my goal. But if I know my family's rights have been violated and they're really continuing to be, or someone is giving them information at the table that is absolutely not in line with the law, I have to fight. I have to be a bulldog for them. They've hired me to fight for them. I try to do that in the most respectful way possible, and not targeting individuals, because it's about more about sometimes a system. But I am telling you, I don't think anybody is excited to see my name, but every once in a while I do. And there are some school districts that they're the least amount of clients we have, because they are
Mhm.
kind of doing, but they're so child focused. And when I do get a call for one of those, it's like, oh, this is going to be the best meeting,
Yeah.
because they listen and they work together and they'll say, that makes good sense. I think we can do that. And it just feels so right. And that's a question I get over and over. Why does it have to be so hard?
Yes. That's my next question. Why is there such a gap? What is
Oh.
where does that come from?
So I really think I absolutely know the answer to this question. It comes from the top. And so when you look at who's running those departments, you know, figure out who those folks are. What's their background? What's their track record? As families, you can FOIA a lot of things, like how many
Mhm.
families have had to file due process in this district? What years there's a lot of information you could find out. But when it's funneled from the top, or the professional development seems to be only led by the attorney for the school district, that's not a good sign,
Right.
because that's more about defending yourself or defending decisions rather than here's the new trends and here's what we can do. So yeah, I think that people sitting at the table, the ones that are in there working with our children diligently, are are often sent a message that, well, this is how we're going to decide on this case. And don't you agree? It's
Mm.
just put in a position. So I'll give you a real life example. I sat at a meeting, the executive director was there, um, and somebody that I've worked very well with through the years. This was a little bit of contentious because of the parent requesting a certain thing for this child. And when it came down to it, and we made that request, the executive director made a statement. Well, we believe this, and that. And so no one else spoke up. So then I said, it's a shame that we didn't hear from, for example, the case manager or this person. And then the director said, well, of course, anyone has the right to speak up. And I said, well, you've already made the statement. That's going to be tough for them. And
Yeah.
it was an honest thing. I'm
Yeah.
not sure it was well received. So it does feel, people say, is it money? And it's not. Here's how it's money. The funds come down, preponderance of funds come down from the federal government, but it's the way the district chooses to use that funds. And I think that's why money can be a factor.
So that's actually one of my questions about how. So I'm just seeing if we can make this like really simple. Like if the federal government gives, let's say, $10,000, I don't know what the numbers are, for a child in a district, and the district's only going to receive those funds because of that child's IEP. Is that correct? And because
Yes.
of their
Yeah.
of their diagnoses or their special education needs, otherwise they wouldn't have the money. Is that true?
Correct.
Okay.
You receive money when you have a child who has become eligible. Let's talk about IDEA because
Yeah.
that's where direct. So you have a child who's become eligible, then funding is there under IDEA for the services, the OT, the PT, whatever, for that individual child. There's funding that comes down. But how that district utilizes staff and utilizes the funding. I mean, it has to be used for the child, but the federal government isn't dictating this much for this much for this. And how a school district uses their special education funding can differ quite a bit. For example, they may say, all our teachers, special ed teachers, do this. And then I have to come in and say, this is an individualized plan. So there's no such thing as, but I fight against some of that. So that's where the issue comes in.
So is it fair to say that there is enough money, but it's often how it's allocated? Because I think the message
Yes.
that parents get is that no one has any money and the schools are all broke and we're asking for things that no
No.
one can afford. Is that true?
No, that is not true. Decisions for children. For example, think about how much money it would cost to have a full time nurse, RN, for a child with a significant health issue to be in school every day.
Yeah.
But you know what? Because that child requires that to get that FAPE that we talked about at the
Mhm.
beginning, I got that for that child. So every day an RN is with that child from the time they get on the school bus till the time they get back to their door. There's nobody that could say, well, we don't have the money. Now, when the parent first called, they were actually told, I don't know if we can educate your child. And of course, that was walked back the minute my name came across their desk as the advocate. But remember, every child has a right to FAPE, and that child has to be able to be educated. That's their legal right, their inherent right as a citizen in this country. So, you know what? That RN had to be hired. Well, where does that money come from? That money has to be allocated for that child to receive FAPE. So it's not about there isn't enough money. It's about the how the school district is utilizing that. Now, staffing, yeah, that's a problem, and that has been a problem. And there isn't enough staffing, but then we've got to find a way. Again, we have to be careful that parents aren't hearing, I'm sorry, your child has a one-to-one aide on here, but we don't have an aide because we can't hire someone, so your child can't come to school.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, I mean, if you really think about it too, not only do we have to be investing in, for example, the equipment that they need at school or the RN that you recommended, but we should be investing in the staff and in their education, in their continuing
yes.
education, in their pay, frankly. I mean, well, I'll say it, we pay our paras deplorably. I mean, it's
Oh,
terrible. It's absolutely disgusting.
horrible,
And these are men
horrible.
and women and people who are like teachers. I mean, frankly, like they are an integrated
Oh,
part of our child's education because they're the one to one. And so
absolutely.
it's like and for me, this is what I think. I go back. It's like, what do we value as a culture? And unfortunately, I will say we don't value the disabled. If the football team needed a brand new something or other because it was going to make money for the school and they were going to win the district championship, we would hop to that in like 30 seconds. But
No
because it's a
kidding.
kid in a wheelchair or it's a teacher that's teaching the kids with autism, like we're not going to invest in them. So it really goes back to what we value and what school systems value. And the thing that kills me and that my husband and I always say to people is like, don't you want to be a best practice? Don't you want to be a district that stands up and says, we're doing a great job. Like, this is how it should be done. And perhaps you could fundraise around that. And you could create something better. But
I
instead,
know.
we
I've heard you
create
say that at the table.
we create
Absolutely.
systems where it's like we just want to keep everybody out. And that isn't good. Like, if you just want to talk about healthy energy, that's not good for the families. That's not good for the staff. That's not good for the paras. Like, I just don't understand why we can't work together. And I think, when we were talking about this, Eric and I, this conversation, he's like, it just goes even to like going to IEP meeting for the first time, sitting at that long table as two parents with like 25 people, and they all go around the room and say all the things your kid's not doing.
Oh,
It's very intimidating. And so
I
it's like
know.
down to that part of the system, it's intimidating. And I just, wonder, and I know it's such a big question, but what can we do about this? Like, how are we going to change this?
Well, one of the things, I mean, that and when I become overwhelmed that I do with the amount
I'm
of
sure.
calls and the amount of heartbreak that I hear from families, it really can affect you. And
Yeah.
so I always say, all right, well, as advocates, we're one child at a time. If I've had 3 meetings today and I fought hard for those 3 children, I can, put my head on
Mhm.
my pillow at night. But I'll use my analogy here. For families, it feels, I call it the secret menu. It feels like you
Mhm.
go to a restaurant and you sit down and they hand you a cheeseburger and they hope you're satisfied and you go away happy. And you don't know that there's a whole menu of things that
Mm.
you could have access to. But here's the disconnect. If, as a family, you don't know your rights, then you don't know what to ask for. You don't know what's on the menu. So you eat the cheeseburger. But the point is, empowering parents, and it's so much a part of what I try to do, Jessica, is empower parents. So I tell them, send your parent concerns ahead of time, take notes, bring somebody with you, never go to an IEP alone. If you can possibly bring somebody, have that person take notes. um, Ask to record the meeting. And I know some school districts feel that's very adversarial, but it's not. You can just say,
Mhm.
I can't participate and record it, type
Yeah, it's a
everything
lot
at
to
once.
take in.
Take the notes and stop and ask questions rather than just have it go through. And don't ever let someone read to you. Make sure you have the paperwork, ask for it to be projected, have the draft in front of you. I mean, there's a legal
Mhm.
requirement in the state of Illinois that 3 days ahead you have to be given drafts. But still, sometimes we're at a meeting and someone says, well, I changed my goal. Here's my new goal. Do you like it? And I always say, excuse me, can you give the parent a copy of that goal? Can you project it?
Mhm.
We don't do well with just listening to it. So I try with each family, or if I do speaking engagements, but Jessica, that's the key. If parents can become more empowered and really the squeaky wheel,
Mhm.
then I think schools will step up if our parents are educated. And I really wish schools would do more in terms of telling parents about their rights. They hand you procedural safeguards because it's a legal requirement. But if I'll ask you as a parent, Jessica, has anyone ever sat down and gone through that with you in a school?
No.
No. And you've been given those from the time Bodie was a baby
Yep.
and he started getting services.
Yep.
No.
No.
One time at a meeting on the East Coast in our DC office, I went to a meeting and the special ed director said, I know you have Carol, but it's also my job, and I'm
Mhm.
going to go through this with you. I was so impressed and so happy. I wanted to hug that individual because you know what? That was really the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I took it wonderfully. It wasn't disrespectful
Mhm.
to me. It was
Mhm.
wonderful for the family because I know if I'm not there, someone's going to do that. But that is an exception,
Hmm. It's almost
not the
like
rule.
we have these great laws. We have ADA, we have IDEA that people have
Yes,
thought a lot about and put a lot of, when you go online and you look up IDEA and you read about it, you're like, this sounds great.
right.
Right? You're like, "Okay, we're on top of this. This is wonderful." The problem is that there's a disconnect between the laws of the land that we have agreed upon in our legislatures and the practice of them in the schools. And so, one of the moms asked me, she said, if, and this is a pretty like bold question, but this is what she said. She said, if someone is breaking the law in your community in somewhere and you know that they are, we would say that's terrible. And then there would be consequences and then change would happen. But
Right.
instead, in the schools, that is happening and there aren't consequences. And unless the parents figure it out, nothing changes and people get away with it and they continue to get paychecks. And that to me
Exactly.
is, I mean, it's disgusting and it's something that I won't stand for because, and I always say
No.
this, my son is not special because I can advocate for him. What he deserves, every child deserves. Like there is like we need to that, and I think that's another thing as parents. Like if we banded together on and said, my kid's not special. He has special specific needs, but him getting those needs fulfilled should not be just because I, Jessica, am his mom and I'm willing to go to a meeting and say things that people don't want to hear. It's something that every child in his classroom or the other classroom or any classroom should receive. And I think that's a
Absolutely.
message that is missing. It's like we all go behind closed doors and shut the doors and, close the blinds and talk about it. We need to be more open about this so that we can take care of our children together.
Oh, you're exactly right, and it's not about that if this child has these needs, he gets more attention or more. It's not about that. Every child that's eligible, those laws protect whether your child has a math disability or significant intellectual disability. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So that is important to say, and the power of parents banding together is something I'm glad you brought up. It is it I really encourage families if they've had a bad experience and or there's been clear-cut violations, make sure you do more than just say it in a meeting. You
Mhm.
know, send a letter. There's avenues with through our states. Educator misconduct, if truly your child's been mistreated by an individual. The state complaints, you can file that. Mediation. And none of these are actually due process. These are things, though, are rights. But if more of that is done, all of a sudden the state board of education takes notice and say,
Mhm.
wow, we've had 25 complaints from this school district.
Hmm.
Does this deserve another lens, another level of scrutiny here? What's going on here? I
Mhm.
mean, that's why one of the bigger cities in this country actually got their special ed implementation rights taken away. Like the state came in because they
Wow.
were doing such a poor job. So, yeah, being the squeaky wheel is important, and parents banding together to make change is crucial. Because again, I see what you're saying. You're highly educated, your husband's an attorney, you have the means to hire an advocate, and but you feel that inequity about other families that don't, and
Right.
it shouldn't be that way. Everyone should be treated the same, but it doesn't occur that way.
So I wanted to ask you just, a couple more tips for parents and advocacy. I mean, you mentioned a few things that you suggested people do. And I think for a lot of people, they're kind of afraid to say something or to speak up because it's very intimidating.
Sure.
And, people have different personalities. But what, is like a little bit of encouragement that you could give to a family who might be listening who's like, ooh, I've never had to do this before. And I can't believe my school system is doing this. I thought they were supposed to take care of my children. Like what what encouragement can you give them to say, no, it's okay to speak up. It's okay to say something.
It is, and I will tell you that I have found that parents that do speak up are all of a sudden it's not that they're looked at necessarily in a negative light. I also see that the level of respect for that family increases when that family starts to do those
Mhm.
things. The things I always say, send parent concerns ahead of time, because in the meeting, it's hard to sit there and talk about your child.
Mhm.
It's very difficult. It's emotional. Send it
Mhm.
ahead and ask it to be put into the IEP, your digital copy of that, so that someone isn't taking notes about your words, because the parent
Mhm.
concerns in an IEP, it's the actual section of the document that's important. So that is your chance to get all of those. And then at the end of the meeting, circle back. Did we address all these parent concerns? Secondly, don't ever talk on the phone to anyone in school about your child, other than can he go on the field trip? But I'm
Yeah.
talking about in terms of needs. Because if it doesn't happen in writing or in an IEP meeting, then we have no accountability. So I'm not saying people are trying to get away with things, but I will tell you, I almost chuckle because someone will hire me and I send my letter of retainment and I say I've
Mhm.
been retained by the family, looking forward to working with you. Inevitably, that family gets a call from
Mm.
somebody calls
Mhm.
from the principal or the special educator. Mrs. So and so, is do you have a problem? You don't need to hire an advocate. So I say, don't talk on the phone. And it's
Yeah.
just again, you're protecting your child. You're not trying to be adversarial. You're protecting your child. The other thing, don't sign a blanket release, especially if your child has either medical or mental health issues, that the school can talk to anyone else just on their own. Any release that you want to share information with your private people, always say on the release with one or more parent in attendance. So if there's a call, you have to be on the call, because I have sat in meetings where, for example, a social worker has said, well, I talked to your child's psychologist and your child's psychologist agrees with me. Well,
Mm.
what? You have no recourse. You weren't even on
Mhm.
that call, but that's not quite the way it was
Mhm.
should have been presented. So protection. These are just good protections, but it elevates you as a
Mhm.
parent, that you're really a strong advocate. Things that might seem trivial are not. If your first IEP meeting, you're sitting in that room with all those people, especially those domain meetings. Put a picture in the front, because I
Mm.
guarantee that OT had never seen your kid, or the psychologist.
Mhm.
Put a picture of your child. Speak from a parent's point of view, and don't let anyone ever say to you, well, I'm so sorry that happens at home, but we don't see that here. Those are words for me that are like fingers on a chalkboard. For someone to disregard a parent, because I always say the parents are the expert on the child.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be respected more than anything. And you need to know as a parent that the law doesn't regard, even if the superintendent is sitting in there, that individual isn't regarded higher than you. And I don't know that parents feel that way.
I don't
They're
think
not
parents
made
know
to feel
that.
that. And I
I
don't
don't.
think they know it. They think it's a hierarchy. It's not. You are equal in the IEP meeting. The only problem is when we come down to decisions about placement or things like that, if we don't have consensus, then the school district can then say, well, our decision is going to be the one. However, getting consensus, you know what? If you have a big decision, bring grandma, bring grandpa, bring an aunt and uncle, stack the room because
Mhm,
it's about consensus. So,
mhm.
those are some tips that I give to parents that can help a parent who maybe doesn't have an advocate, but to elevate themselves.
Those are such good things. So, you go through that process with the IEP and they offer you something. And yeah, I know you talked a little bit about consensus, but if there's something that you're offered that you don't like or that you want to do differently, you mentioned that parents are equals. So we can say that is not something that I think is going to work or I'd like to do something different. We're allowed to ask for something different. Is that correct?
Absolutely, because remember the decision. So, using the word offered, that's how it feels. Well, so
Mhm,
we think that your child will do well in this classroom. But every decision has to be made on data. So, as a parent, if you're not going to agree with that, start with where's the data that shows that. So, start with
mhm,
that because then you might be throwing people off because it might have been predetermined already. So, ask for the data and then remind everyone we have to make decisions based on data. So, in the present levels, everyone said when all the teachers gave their reports, they said, he's so well behaved, he's doing so well. But now you're telling me you want him in a classroom for kids with behavioral problems?
mm,
That doesn't, work. So don't, it's not about, well, my opinion is this about based on my son's needs or my daughter's needs, they require this. So I always tell parents, don't say, I would like him to be in this, I would like him to have this. You want to state, he requires this piece of equipment in order to access his education. He requires to be with his typical peers so he can build his communication skills. You want to put him in a class with other children who are nonverbal, but that's not going to help him with communication models. So use the word require. Now, if it comes down to, well, we have a disagreement here, Mrs. Demas, because we believe that the data shows this. Then you need to state and make sure it's in the notes. We are not in agreement. We do not have consensus. Let's assume there's more of them than you
mhm,
parents, whatever. And so you're not going to come to agreement there. So then you say, we do not agree. You follow it with a letter of dissent saying, we do not agree. And the data does not support this based on this, and that. And then use some of the means that the state gives us. Try first early resolution, which means meet with some of the higher ups and say, you know what,
mhm,
I believe this meeting was predetermined or this or that. We need to look at this more. Sometimes they're willing to do that because they might realize that, yeah, this didn't go as it should have. And rather than having this family sue us, let's see if we can fix it.
mhm.
You could try mediation from the state, that's free to families. And the mediators are great. They're so objective and they work hard to come to consensus. You can write a state complaint if you absolutely feel that your voice wasn't heard. The law protects a family's right to meaningful participation. So you cannot sit there and be passive and let everybody else talk about your child and say, here's what we designed for them. Because then violating your right.
It's not empowering. So I think the message that if you're listening is to advocate for your child, that you do have a lot of rights, that the law is designed
Yeah.
to protect you as parents, and that even if someone doesn't tell you that, it's actually true, and you just have to keep taking a step and then a step. There was a recent Supreme Court case, Perez versus Sturgis Public Schools,
Oh,
and you can
yeah.
look it up if you want. I can put it in the show notes. But what I noticed and thought about is that was a long fight. The family
Oh,
kept fighting, and this was over access to education for those of you listening, um, for a student having access. And they were denied. I mean, I think in different courts, and they just kept going. And it kind of gave me the chills when I read about it, because I thought to myself, how many times you go to a meeting and you get to your car and you feel like you've just been a punching bag, and you're like, I'm giving up this fight. It's not even worth it. Nobody cares. I'm just gonna. But it's like these people modeled what happens when you continue to advocate for your child. And years later, like, they won in the Supreme Court, and it was in a unanimous ruling. So I just think it's a good message to all of us as parents to continue to love your kids, to know your rights, and to fight for them.
yes. And if I might add, with that
Yeah.
Perez case, it was such an amazing case for us as well, is because it's the first time that now we are saying to parents, even if your child is protected under ADA, that families can still sue the school district, um, be, if that child has not been provided FAPE.
Hmm.
So this is going to open the floodgates for
Yeah.
ADA lawsuits. But it's so important because our families often, and not only does it help them to get what their child needs, but they can actually claim for damages. And
Oh,
that has
wow.
not happened before. So, under typically, if a Section 504 was being violated, let's say you have a child with a 504 plan and they were supposed to get certain accommodations and the school didn't provide them, that would be done through the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, kind of overseas. But now our courts are open to even ADA lawsuits as well for
Wow.
access. So, another good case, this and the Andrew F. case that I talked about before, just huge wins for families. But
Hmm.
I really do, it can be overwhelming with the amount of families that aren't getting what they need for kids. But at the same time, the more we bring these cases, we talk about them. We talk about them with families, and like your podcast is such an amazing thing. This is what really does not only give information, but empowers families to say, you know what? Yes,
Hmm.
my child deserves it. I'm going to go in there and fight, and I'm not going to worry that all of a sudden, I actually have people say, if I disagree with the school, will they take it out on my child? I
Hmm.
mean, God forbid. This is not a bullying situation. And if
Hmm.
anything like that ever happened, the OCR they would be the ones to contact immediately, because that falls under retaliation, which is taken very seriously. And I tell parents, never, don't ever let the fear of your
Hmm.
child being mistreated because you've come in and disagreed. Just do it respectfully, but you can fight as hard as you need to for your child, because you are their main advocate.
Hmm. So, there's this increase in need for advocacy. And obviously, like, this is time and money. And one of my big beefs is the fact that if we're in a public school system and we're taxpayers, and you've heard me say this in meetings, and I'll just say it here,
Yeah.
and then we expect the law to be followed and our kids to get what they need, but then we have to hire advocates, so we're paying taxes and we're paying for advocates, which I think is another, like, wild violation of all kinds of things, from ethics to the law to other things. And
It
it's something that I
is.
feel extremely strong about, and no one has agreed with me except for people like you. um, but the reality is that it's expensive for people, and the total BS
Yeah.
part of this, frankly, is that it becomes an option for people that can afford it. And so you
Mm.
recently created the Stephen Dimas Family Scholarship for Educational Advocacy, and I think it's awesome. So I wanted you to
Thank
talk
you.
about that a little bit and talk about Stephen and your husband and your family, and why this is so important, because I know you want
Yeah.
as many people to have access to advocacy as possible.
Well, thank you. Yes. And so this is something that has always weighed heavily on me about all the families that can't afford advocacy and
Mhm.
aren't getting that. And so when I go in and I'm able to change really the trajectory of a child's life because getting them the right, but then I think, what about those all those
Mhm.
other students that don't have this available?
Yeah.
And my late husband, who died from cancer, was a huge proponent in helping me start my business. He was an entrepreneur, but he was also an educator at Northwestern University, taught at the middle school, at the medical school, excuse me, and he really um, helped me so much and was the biggest proponent. He used to make, when I'd leave for a meeting, he'd say, "Do you have a tough one today?" Yeah, I'd say, "Yeah," and he'd do the Wonder Woman
Oh,
sign to me, like, "You
I
got this,"
love
you
it.
know. Yeah.
That's cool.
So as the 10-year anniversary of his
Mhm.
passing came to be, I sat my children down, my adult children, and said, "I want to do something to really honor your father." And so here's what I was
Mhm.
thinking of: establishing this foundation and actually providing monies to families who are in underserved communities or in that poverty range, who could
Mhm.
never afford this but have a child with a disability that needs help. So we started this foundation, and we have raised enough money that right now we have 8 families that have received
Wow.
scholarships and are getting help that they would have never gotten. And it's making me so excited. And we've been getting more and more
Mm.
applications. And I encourage anyone to apply. But it is based on needs of the child, needs of the family. We use kind of the standards of what's considered poverty, but we take a lot into consideration
Yeah.
because we can have a family that, they're making a good salary. However, they have multiple children with disabilities or
Mm.
expenses, medical needs or things. So still it would be a hardship. So it's
Yep.
not like there's a cut point, and I want
Right.
families to know that. But it's been just so rewarding um, to help these families, and I'm so proud of this foundation, and I'm so grateful for all the wonderful donations that we've received. So I feel good about it. We're going to continue, and there's an application for it. It's the Stephen Demas Foundation .com, and there's a application, and we have certain times of the year that we're doing
Mhm.
these, but we've been able to make a difference already.
That's
And
awesome.
we thought we might do a couple of families. It hasn't even been a year, and we've been able to provide 8 scholarships for advocacy
Wow.
fees. So
And the
yeah,
cool thing about that is that there probably may be schools or school districts that typically wouldn't have advocates.
you're
So
right.
hopefully there's a ripple effect happening, right? So you get in there with one
Yes.
kid, and the ripple effect is that other children in the classroom or in the program also, people, maybe their eyes open a little bit, and then they provide it for other kids. I hope.
Jessica, you are so right. I mean, one of the families that received the scholarship is in a more of a rural area. They told me they'd never had an advocate. I walked up to the school, which was kind of in the middle of a cornfield, and the actual superintendent of the school district, but it's such a small district, was at the meeting, and he said, "So you're an advocate. What does an advocate do?" And I was like, "Oh boy!"
Oh
But
no.
anyway, it actually turned out pretty favorably for
That's
that
awesome.
child. Yeah, but it's been wonderful. Yeah.
That's
So
awesome.
thank you for bringing it
Yeah,
up.
we'll link that in the show notes too, so
Thank
people can
you.
take a look at that and donate if you
Thank
feel led,
you.
because it's I mean, I will tell you personally, it's an incredible cause and it's an important cause, and I think it's a way if you're a parent listening who has typical healthy children who have never had to deal with this,
Yeah.
you should be so thankful for it, but there are so many families that do, and that would be a way that you could support families who are,
Thank you.
trying to do their best for their kids, and also it's a way that you can support your community to elevate your
Right.
schools. So I think every
Yes.
time we get an advocate into schools, again, this is a belief that I have. I actually see it as I know people don't the people in the room don't often see it this way, but I see it as my gift to my community because I'm asking them to elevate their program not only for my son, but for other children in the community.
Right.
So I think
And you've seen that. You've seen that
yeah,
happen, Jessica.
we
You
have to
have.
continue to raise the bar, and so,
Yeah.
supporting the Stephen Dimas Family Scholarship would be a way to do
Thank
that.
you.
So,
Thank
before we
you.
close, I have 2 more things for you. What gives you hope, Carol? Like, this is a tough go. There are, I mean, you could do this for the next 100 years, and God, I hope it continues to improve. But just, I mean, what personally gives you hope and in a sense that, you can continue?
I think the idea that, first of all, I also sat as a parent in an IEP meetings for one of my children. So I I saw myself the way you can strongly advocate
Mhm.
can make a difference,
Mhm.
and that for all the pushback and the gatekeepers and the fight, there are also all of these incredibly grateful students. And if I
Mm.
may share a story that
Yeah.
I think personifies what gives me hope. I got an email from a college student, and this college student was someone that I advocated for
Oh,
when he
wow.
was just going from middle school to high school. And he sent me an email and he said, I remember how hard you fought for me.
Wow.
And I mean, it makes me choke up.
Sure.
And I would like to go into your field.
Oh my gosh.
So he came and met with me, and, he asked me where to get started, and
Wow.
so I told him which books to read and kinda some stuff, and then I've been, Zooming with, him to kind of talk about things, and
Wow.
he's actually going to be doing some interning for me this summer. So,
Oh,
the
that's so
full
good.
circle moment for me
Yeah.
that it's like, wow, that resonated with him. And he even used the term in his email, "I remember you kicked butt," and I just love that.
I love it. That's
He
cool.
wants to do that,
Yeah.
and so I think that's what gives me hope.
Hope. That's an awesome story. So I'm
Thanks.
asking all of my guests this question as we close the podcast. So the season on the Heartstrong podcast, I'm focusing on who we become as people and what we create in this world from the heartbreak that we witness around us and the adversities that we face as humans. And so I'm wondering, Carol, like what do you like about yourself? What do you like about Carol because of the challenges that you face? That you've got something that you're like, this is a beautiful thing that has come out of my life challenge.
Oh, gosh. Well, becoming a widow, when I did,
Mhm.
certainly was, such a heartbreak for me,
Yeah.
um, and but when my husband was very ill, I said, I just need to step away from my advocacy work right now. I really do.
Mhm.
And he said, I need you not to do that. This is something that is ingrained in you now and you do
Mm.
so much good. Please don't do that.
Hmm.
And I think it was a gift he gave me because I kept going. Obviously, it took a few months off after he passed, but I kept going. And afterwards, to help me with to heal and the
Mhm.
loneliness was really throwing myself into my work.
Mm.
and always my family. But my work, and I think it helped me to become as successful as I am in
Mhm.
my advocacy firm and grow it
Mm.
and help more families. So out of that heartbreak, I think I became extremely hardworking, focused, and dedicated. And I know my passions, and I'm not afraid to go the length. And I like that about myself. I've
Mhm.
been to Congress twice because of how passionate I am to stop physical restraint and isolation for students, those
Mhm.
horrible timeout rooms and that stuff.
Mhm.
I know my focus, and I think throwing myself into my work and staying focused and knowing that for every meeting I have that I feel beaten down because I don't get anywhere, I'll have two or three that are great wins that can change the
Mhm.
trajectory of a child's life. And if I can do that, then all the hard work and the disappointment I can deal with that. And I like that about myself. And also that, a lot of people at my age are like, retiring. And I
Mhm.
don't want to retire yet because
You're
I
just
still
getting
feel like I have
started.
more to do. So
Yes,
I'm going to keep
keep
going
going.
until yeah.
I love that.
So
Well, Carol, you are making a difference in so many families' lives. I mean, this is like a borderline ministry sometimes, I think, what you're doing. And
thank
it's so
you.
needed in this world. And you've made such a difference in our family. And I am so thankful for you personally. But I know
Thank
the world
you.
is a better place because you're here. So thank you for being
Thank
here.
you. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me here on the Heartstrong podcast. Please rate and review this podcast and share an episode that you love with a friend, because when you do, you help us grow our mission of encouraging people to grow through the challenges of their lives and to live their full potential. We'll see you next time.